it's better for them to sit
It's
in the
better to
outer.
do it in the queue on, and each individual microphone will sit on.
That's the problem we had last time. We wondered whether it was because obviously they were sat
Yeah,
around.
it's just generic, that one, I'm afraid. So
Yes, no, that's fine. Yeah, yeah.
If you're in the on that, that's you just get the view of the table.
Yes, and this is what we had last time. I realised it.
One of the other chairs. Yeah.
Yeah, so the camera goes like that. I'll make sure they don't see it.
Yeah.
Because that was the problem last time, and it got. David said, "Oh well," it blamed on me, and I said, "Well, I don't think you should have sat there in the first place." But and in terms of actually working it,
have you got any presentation or anything?
no, it's literally just it'll just be a straightforward.
I'll show you in a minute when I've got it all.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Go from there.
For Surrey. This is the latest of the public accountability meetings that I, as Police and Crime Commissioner, have with the Chief Constable, Mr. Gavin Stevens, who's with me. I need to congratulate you yet again, Mr. Stevens, for being appointed as Chief Constable. And I very much look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead. I hope people for the next 2 hours will find this interesting and indeed entertaining. And we'd very much value your comments, both positive and negative, about what you see and hear. And of course, if you write in or email in, we'll do our very best to answer those. But let's get straight on then. For the performance scrutiny meeting. I'll better introduce I'm flanked by Chief Executive Lisa Harrington and the Treasurer Ian Perkins. And you have got Chief Constable. You've got. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Commissioner. Gavin Stevens, Chief Constable of Surrey, and this morning I'm accompanied by Peter Gillett.
Thank you very much. So that's the introduction on, and as now newly appointed Chief Constable, I'd be very interested to hear your initial thoughts on where you want Surrey Police to go.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, I'll just take the opportunity to set out a few thoughts for those watching and listening. And of course, this comes on the back of we've recently completed a round of events at all 11 boroughs and districts across Surrey to set out our thoughts, and I'd like to thank people for coming along to those events. If you haven't managed to make one of the events, we are actually taking questions online this evening. If anybody wanted to join us and pose any questions about what I'm about to say. So.
Sorry to interrupt. It is in fact tomorrow evening.
Oh, apologies.
The online event,
yep.
Yes. Yeah.
This evening is our passing out parade for new recruits. Yeah, and you have 2 evening engagements. So if anybody can join us tomorrow evening, that would be great. Look forward to continuing the good work of my predecessor, Nick Fgrave. And together with Nick, a few years ago, we had set out a very clear vision for Surrey Police on one page. To keep it simple and straightforward, not just for all of our staff, so that communities could see where our priorities were too. And I've no intention in the short term of changing that very clear vision, which is to make Surrey the safest county it can possibly be. The 3 components of that plan are to prevent crime, to protect vulnerable people, and to pursue offenders, particularly those that cause high harm or prey on the vulnerable. So those are very sort of clear ambitions that will remain. However, I think there are some nuances from my experience over recent years where we can put more energy and attention to help us in that aim of achieving the safest county. The first thing to say is that our partnership with Sussex Police remains very strong. And it's our intention to build on that. I've spoken with Chief Constable Giles York. In fact, one of the reasons that our new Deputy Chief Constable Jeremy Burton isn't with us here this morning is that he's interviewing today with the Chief Constable of Sussex for Chief Superintendents across Surrey and Sussex. So just an indicator of how closely we work together. And I've agreed with Mr York that we will continue to develop our vision together. So we're planning a series of events for both of our senior teams over the summer to strengthen the partnership and make sure that our sort of vision for both organisations is very closely aligned. From a Surrey point of view, as I mentioned, there are a few areas of focus for us, so I'll just take you through those in turn. The first is when you look at what's been happening to demand for policing services through the years of austerity, they have been rising significantly. The range of demand on policing is now broadened well away from simple crime issues. Of course, antisocial behaviour has always been something that we've tackled, but increasingly we receive many calls about vulnerability, people in crisis, concerns within communities. So there's a real need to focus on prevention. So that's my first sort of point of focus, as it were, to do more preventative work. and indeed from the uplift to local taxation to the precept, we're proposing to spend around £2 million of that £3.8 million uplift on preventative activity. So that's more local neighbourhood officers, more youth intervention work, for example. And I've been recently visiting Durham Constabulary, which is rated as outstanding across the board, to look in particular at their approach to problem-solving activity. The second area is, I believe there's more that we can do in local partnerships. So, of course, the partnership with Sussex has been important to us over recent years, as has our regional partnership with other forces. However, public services in Surrey recognise this need to do more preventative activity too. So, for example, my senior team and the senior team of Surrey County Council have a meeting this Friday to talk about joint prevention opportunities in partnership. I was struck by my recent visit to Durham Constabulary about the strength of some of the local partnerships up there and how that helps them to achieve some outstanding results. So I'll certainly be putting more energy and attention to our local partnerships. And then the final sort of point of focus is that I see my responsibility as chief to get the full potential from the organisation. Now, of course, much of that comes from our people, the fantastic colleagues that I'm lucky to work with. But the skills required in policing are changing rapidly, new technologies and so on, so we must continue to invest in the development of our officers and staff so that they can achieve their full potential. So we will do that. We will make that a sort of clear focus for us. And the other area where we need to get the full potential from the organisation is from our information that we hold. If policing had a share price, it would be public confidence. We need to work closely with the public, but for policing to be effective, it needs to make the most of the information that the public gives us and the other agency gives us in order to best direct our resources, to make effective decisions at point of dealing with incidents on the street, to understand the long-term patterns and trends which have been a focus of the inspectorate over recent years, so we're not caught out by new and emerging crime types and that we can adjust our resources accordingly. So getting the full potential from our information, in my view, is equally as important as getting the full potential from our people. So I shall end it there as a sort of quick overview of how I intend to lead the force over the coming months and years, and open up for any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Constable. Thank you for sharing that. I've, of course, heard you saying all that before. I agree with it all. It's an ambitious plan, a high-level plan, and I would absolutely support you there. It's very much in line with my police and crime plan, which I know is the you have at your fingertips as well. I see nothing there that contradicts it. In fact, everything there that actually enhances it. So I'm very pleased with that. I've just got a couple of questions. You talked about the collaboration with Sussex Police, and clearly that's the heart of what we do. I'm glad to say, in your view, that's going strong. There is, of course, four-way collaboration as well, with including Hampshire and Thames Valley. I wonder if you'd just like to say how you feel the four-way dovetailing in with the two-way.
Yes, so I recently met at Chief Constable's Council with my regional colleagues. So John Campbell's been recently appointed as the Chief Constable in Thames Valley, Olivia Pinkney in Hampshire, and of course Giles York in Sussex. We had this very discussion about the strength of the regional partnership, which remains very important to us, particularly for regional functions such as counter-terrorism, serious and organised crime. Those are services that are provided very effectively from the region. And of course we will remain fully committed to that. Likewise, there are some major technology reforms that are taking place across the region that we remain committed to, and we all agreed that we must make it easier for our staff that are working between the forces and within these regional units to make sure that that's an attractive career option for them, and that we can promote and develop talent through those regional arrangements. So where we can achieve the economies of scale by doing things regionally. So, for example, our response to some of the national programmes of work that we're required to implement, if we can implement those once across the region, then we will do. So remain very much committed to that partnership too.
Good, thank you. And the second point I had, you talked about the Surrey County Council, the importance of working with them, which I absolutely agree. I think they're probably the single most important local authority. That's not to neglect boroughs and district at all, of course. But just to emphasise, I agreed with the leader of Surrey County Council as soon as he was appointed a few weeks back that we would work up a high-level concordat with the county. I'm glad to say my office has now produced the first draft, which I think was shared with yourself. If not, obviously, we'll get there. It was. And that's now gone off to county for their comments, and that will provide the overarching strategic framework for the excellent operational work that obviously you'll be engaged on. So it looks as though we're marching in step there very well. Good. Any final words, Chief Constable, before we move through the agenda?
I guess the final words is to those that are watching and listening to say that the most important partnership to me, and this is very much part of my policing philosophy from an early age, is that with our local communities, because without the support of local communities, we cannot provide a good service. So very much welcome at any stage, not just through our formal community engagement meetings, but at any stage, comments, questions, engagement from local communities about what they think of their policing services, and always happy to come and talk to local groups to hear their views too.
And of course, me too. Right, let's go there on then for item 3 then, the actions from the previous meeting. Everybody happy that they were a true record of the meeting? I'll take that as a yes. I didn't myself pick up anything that isn't in the action log, which I now propose to go through. But if anybody thinks of anything, then we can take that at the end. We've got a one-page of actions. I think most of them are discharged, but I'll go through them anyway. The first one is proposed response plans to possible traveller encampments. I have been talking to the team there on that. There's a little way to go before I see the detailed plan, but I did have a meeting some 10 days ago and was very confident that things were progressing very well. What we can't afford is a repeat of last year, of course, where the county, especially the north of the county, was absolutely inundated with unauthorised encampment. And I've got to keep saying it. It was only a minority of those encampments which caused serious trouble, but that minority did cause serious trouble, and we've got to be absolutely on the ball in conjunction with local authorities to make quite sure that firstly that community tensions don't get as strained as last year, and secondly that the settled community feels it has confidence in the police and their local authorities. Would you like to comment on that, Chief?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Assistant Chief Constable Nev Kemp has been looking at this issue over the closed season, as it were, over the winter months, to refine our plans for intelligence collection, cooperation with local authorities, better risk assessment and early response. We have had some unauthorised encampments already this year across the county, and I think feedback has been good about our response, joint response to those with local authorities so far. Of course, we're about to enter a time of the year, particularly in the run-up to the Epsom Derby, where we may see more activity. And the other thing, just to let local communities know, we are entering a particularly busy time for Surrey Police and our regional colleagues. Not only do we have the Epsom Derby, we have some significant events across the county, in particular a European convention of Hells Angel motorcyclists, which is makes its way around Europe from year to year. It's a 50th anniversary event this year, which is being held in Surrey, which is a significant impact on policing resources. That comes at the same time as the Derby. And also there are commitments across the region to some of the D-Day celebrations and the visit of the American president. So I do ask for some understanding from local communities that police resources are stretched, but we will absolutely remain committed to responding effectively as we can to unauthorised encampments.
Good. And yes, on that point, this is, as you say, a very, very busy week. And added to all that you talked for, we have the President of the United States in this country, not coming to Surrey, I understand, but nevertheless, that puts an extra strain. I've attended a couple of the planning meetings for the Hells Angels business, and I'm very happy that Surrey Police and Sussex Police's plans are well underway. It will be a strain. I think you know that I did actually ask, I took legal advice as to whether it was possible to ban it, because it comes a particularly unfortunate time for the police. And I was told very firmly by QC that under current British law it is not possible to ban it, so we're stuck with it. And I wish you the very best of luck for all that. It won't be for want of trying. So thank you for that. Right, the next action is ICT. I'm happy that's put back till the 3rd of July, so we get proper data in which we can scrutinise that. Workforce development we'll be doing later. Screening out data. I'm happy that is postponed for that. Would you just like to explain to anybody listening what we actually mean by screening out? I know, but you're probably the best person to explain.
Yeah, we don't really use that phrase either, because it's sort of a summary of what is a range of decisions. So when a crime is reported to us, we make two assessments really. One is to look at the solvability factors of that crime. So is there the potential to solve the crime, to detect who's responsible for it, and there are a range of criteria that we look at for that. That's not the only judgment we make on it though. We also look at the vulnerability of the victim, the risk of harm, for example. And so even if something is not solvable but there's a vulnerable victim, then we will still visit. So it's not like we maintain a particular list about things we do and don't do. Each thing that is reported to us will get an assessment of are we likely to solve it, and are there any needs of the victim that need responding to. Of course, if neither of those are present, then the crime will be filed for intelligence purposes. We'll look at the patterns and trends, but we won't necessarily attend, and sometimes that overall process is referred to as screening out.
Thank you very much. So look forward to that. The next one, positive outcomes, we'll be covering that in more detail in the public performance report. But just like to say, and of course I know you and the force are very concerned on positive outcomes, and we would all like to see those positive outcomes. The percentages go up, but we'll talk later on that. Victim care compliance, and I'm happy a report comes back in 6 months' time, which is just over 6 months since the new victim and witness care unit came into being. I won't go into that, as we'll be doing a lot on that later on. The use of force in custody. I was just making the comment, I haven't seen any comparisons, or sharp comparisons nationally, and I think I'd really like that as well. And there's a couple of actions which are related to that. 101, I know the force is always reviewing the 101 system, which is getting much better than it was, which is good news. Serious violence, organised crime, that's coming to us and the Community Safety Board on the 11th of June. Anything you'd like to say on serious violence?
Only that the strategy is progressing well. We also had a useful meeting, I know you were there, Commissioner, too, with our local health partners recently, who are very much contributing to that strategy with the data that they have too.
And the last specific action is about County Lines briefing document. I've got that, and that's fine. Before we put the minutes of the last meeting to bed, is any final comments on that?
Only just a brief comment on the last action. It was the County Lines week of action last week across the country nationally. People may have seen some coverage on that on the news this morning, and we were very active participants in that too.
And I was out with the force as well last week, and be very interested once we feel able to release our what we did, which we can't quite yet, I think. Then I'd be very interested to see that. Yes, but when I did go out last week, I was very impressed by the enthusiasm and dedication of everybody, both humans and police dogs. They were both working very hard. Good. And then to the public performance report, progress against the police and crime plan. And what I'd like to do is go through it and paragraph by paragraph. Let me just get my papers together. Yeah. Right, we start with the volume of recorded crime. That is going up, the volume. Any comments on that?
The increases in crime in Surrey are broadly in line with national recording increases. I know we've covered at previous performance meetings the reasons behind increases in levels of reporting and recording. National increase is around 7%, and in Surrey it's around 3%. We are still the seventh lowest crimes per thousand population across England and Wales, so Surrey remains very much a safe county when you look at recorded crime, and we have the lowest rate within the South East region too. So broadly stable, trends in line with national changes.
Thank you. And a lot, but not all, of the increases are still either neutral, because I understand the classification of some crimes has altered, or beneficial, because it means people are reporting them more. But if you strip those out, there's still a rise in crime in certain areas. Is there anything in particular which is at a variance with what's happening elsewhere, and so we should be looking at particularly closely?
Nothing particularly at variance, but there are some trends that we want to keep a very close eye on, and indeed some of these were confirmed to us through the local engagement meetings. So whereas we'd been doing particularly well for acquisitive crime over recent years, we have seen an upturn in some offences, particularly thefts from vehicles, so thefts of tools from trades vans. Has been a particular problem for us, especially in the northern parts of the county. So to encourage people to remain vigilant about that and take prevention measures wherever possible. We are keeping on top of the burglary issues, thankfully. So, you know, prevention messages, the work that we're doing with local communities in prevention is working well. The other area, I think, where we see increasing trends is in some of the serious violence, particularly sexual violence, and we would very much consider reporting in that area to be a good thing, that people are having the confidence to come forward and to get the necessary support.
Thank you, but it still means extra work for police officers actually dealing with the rise, of course. The second bit is the volume of positive outcomes. We touched on it briefly before, and that's both the volume and the rate there. And I'd made a note, but actually you've sort of answered it. Are we getting help, advice from other forces? But you've just been up to Durham, you're telling, and presumably that was one of the things on your agenda.
Yeah, it's certainly in investigative standards was something that I was looking at up there, and in particular the technology to support those investigations, so that you know, colleagues can be really effective and efficient in the way that they're dealing with these crime reports. So I think that the headline on positive outcomes, so for those watching and listening that may not be fully au fait with what that means, so there are a broader range of ways that we can result a crime investigation now. In fact, there are 21 reasons that we can give when we complete a crime investigation to categorise what's happened to that as to whether it's been successful or not. And in broad terms, outcomes number 1 to 8 are considered to be positive outcomes. There are some others that could be argued actually beneficial too, but nevertheless they're not regarded as positive. So in terms of volume of positive outcomes, they're broadly stable. So in the previous year to March, we'd recorded 11,239 positive outcomes. In the most recent period, 11,142. So, you know, within 100 or so of that number, which is, you know, a variation of less than 1%. But where I think I and the Deputy Chief Constable really want to focus our effort is positive outcomes in relation to those more serious and high harm offences, where I think our communities and particularly the victims concerned would want to see a better performance. So areas such as rape and serious sexual offending, where of course there's been a greater focus on the disclosure regime required, examination of digital devices, obtaining of third-party material. This sort of shift in our process and much more energy and attention on it has resulted in a slowdown of cases going through the system and appearing before the courts. I was discussing this very issue with our local judiciary down at Guildford in recent weeks. So we've got a collective effort to try and improve our positive outcome rate in those particular categories.
I think it's a greater worry than it was 1 or 2 years ago. The positive outcome rate is, I accept it's a small decline. The graphs in front of us are rather exaggerated, but nevertheless there is a decline. So we'll be looking to see in more detail what the force are actually proposing to do about it, and there is a report, as we said, coming. And look for a very detailed report in October, and of course also look for an upturn, as does everybody in the force. I fully accept that. Yeah. But there is the next one is problem-solving occurrences. That does seem to me like good news, and perhaps you'd like to just explain that.
So one of the first things that the previous Chief Constable and I wanted to begin to measure was the volume of problem-solving activity. And I think you can see from the figures here that we are driving up the amount of problem-solving activity across the force. So it's pretty much trebled within the course of the year, which is a good thing. That tells me that the training that we've been doing and the communication that we've been doing is being understood and being acted upon. Where I'll turn my attention to over the coming years, and it goes back to the point I was making at the start of the meeting about preventative activity, is now begin to look in detail at the quality of that problem-solving activity. We've recently undertaken a round of training for senior leaders in problem-solving, so they can give good oversight and support to it. And some of the investment money from the precept will be directed exactly towards this activities to improving the quality, and I'm absolutely convinced that where we do this well, it will in turn lead to better positive outcomes as well.
Good, thank you. Obviously, we all hope that's the case. Yeah. Dealing with antisocial behaviour and crime, there has been a drop of 5 percentage points from 77% to 72%. 72% is still high, but it's not as high as it was. Why do you think has happened, and what are you doing about it?
There are a few factors here. There were some particular areas of the county, as we touched on earlier in the meeting, that suffered particularly badly from a minority of groups around unauthorised encampment that caused significant levels of antisocial behaviour. So we've got response plans in those boroughs and districts specifically to deal with that. The other theme, however, came through also strongly in the engagements events across boroughs and districts, and that was the antisocial behaviour associated with local drug dealing. So on the street, or certainly visible to local communities, if not directly on the street, drug dealing, the sort of pervasiveness of the availability of drugs now, the competition in the marketplace, hence all of our activity against the county lines work last week. So I think communities are noticing that and the antisocial behaviour that comes with that sort of activity. And they've also noticed, understandably so, some of the more, I suppose, not minor to them, because if you're living with it every day, it becomes a significant issue. But some of the things that make life less tolerable in a local community, and the absence in some visible policing through the years of austerity, communities have definitely noticed that, and I see that. I think we see that in some of these figures, and of course we've got a clear intention to invest new money this year back into local policing, which I'm sure will have some impact on this issue.
Yes, I was with you. You and I did joint community engagement events 11 throughout the county, and I absolutely agree. That was a common theme running through all that on the low-level antisocial behaviour. And I was struck by the huge importance of borough commanders, 11 borough commanders, actually gripping that. And I believe they are gripping that, but I'm sure you would agree with me, it's a very big responsibility for borough commanders, the inspectors, but it's also a very big opportunity for them, and I'm sure you're monitoring their performance, and but also giving congratulations where they're due, and they are due in many, many areas. Yeah.
I would agree with that, Commissioner. Thank you. I think each of the borough commanders gave examples at the events about some fantastic joint work and results that they're getting. There were many, many examples across the county, but of course the volume of this activity is significant. So, maybe 100 calls per day that we'll get relating to antisocial behaviour matters. So it is a lot for them to do. Of course, they're very reliant on the support of their local authority, for those that have got joint enforcement team, for example, in this area. But also local communities too. One of the things that I've been thinking about since I took office, and a few borough commanders have taken steps in this direction too, is how they engage the broader workforce in dealing with some of these issues. Of course, yesterday and Sunday, where we have days of action, one particular part of that, but how do we make sure that happens day in, day out? And there is some new research from studies that were done out in Australia and in Peterborough in this country about how to engage the workforce in this, and I'll certainly be looking at how we can implement that in Surrey.
Thank you very much. Yes, the 100 extra officers and staff that are being put in place, they're not actually there yet, of course, but your recruiting and training machine is working flat out to get those in post. They surely will make a difference, and that's the whole point of them. So very much look for that public confidence a statistic to go in the right direction in future. Call handling and deployment, don't think I need to say too much about that. Consistently high standards now. Couldn't have said that 2 years ago, but there's been a dramatic improvement, and hopefully that will be maintained, but under no illusions in the face of rising demand month after month after month. It's a struggle to keep on top of it, so congratulations to the very many people who are in the contact centre and so on for actually keeping on top of that. Yeah, they're doing a good job. The emergency response performance, that has reduced a little over the last 12 months. Would you like to comment on that, Chief?
So, yep, the grade one, so the clear emergencies, as it were, those things that we want to get to as quickly as we possibly can. The performance on that has been broadly stable. The next grade down for our response is where we try and get there within the hour. We certainly don't achieve that as much as we would like to. We have seen an upturn in performance over recent months, but we'll continue our focus on that area to really give that commitment that if we say we're going to get there in the hour, then we will do our utmost to do that. At the moment, it's in just over 50% of the time that we achieve that, which is, you know, from the caller's perspective, not good enough. Of course, there'll also be opportunities for us just to have that conversation and manage expectations, because if it doesn't need to be an hour, actually, if an hour and a half is okay or 2 hours is okay, then we just need to be upfront about that conversation and let people know too.
Right, okay. Before I leave this section, one other theme that came through on the community engagement meetings, quite a steady theme, was people really appreciated feedback when it was given, and they didn't appreciate being left in the dark. And there were quite more than one people were saying that, and I obviously sympathise with them. Is that something that you're looking at specifically?
Yes, it certainly is. I thought that was a very strong theme that came through the meetings, that although our initial call handling was good, I mean, there were some comments about delays on 101, but as we can see from the figures here, average wait times of just over a minute. It's broadly a very good service. So, you know, initial call taking good, but then receiving the feedback about what happened to their call, particularly if we weren't going to send a resource and it was something that the neighbourhood team perhaps would pick up the following day. To let people know what happened, we weren't nearly as good as that as people would like. So that's something that I've been talking to the local team about. We're putting together a set of proposals, and I'm sure that we can improve the experience and service for local residents as a consequence of the feedback.
As we move on, terrorism, I think there has been much better cooperation now on the prevent side, cooperation with local authorities in particular, and very pleased about that. But of course, as we all know, we can't afford to let our guard drop for a single second, and it's absolutely right that is the case. So I'll go on from there. The Building Confident Communities aspect, a crime survey for England and Wales. We were number 1, we're now number 3. I'm sure you have the ambition to just pip the other 2 forces. I don't know who they are, so we get back to number 1 again. But it's pretty good. Out of 43 forces, to be number 3 is pretty good.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. We jockey for position within a percentage point or 2 at the top of this league table. It's pretty like the Premier League table this season. There's been sort of 1 or 2 points in it, so but we maintain our ambition to be right at the top.
Thank you. And confidence in neighbourhood policing, this ties in very much with what we were talking about. Anything you'd like to say on that? There has been a slight drop in confidence there.
Yeah, so the local, the Crime Survey of England and Wales is, of course, a national survey. We also do a local survey jointly with the local authorities, where we survey 6,000 residents a year. The figures in this one broadly mirror the national trend, and we're down a couple of percentage points, but still very high levels. We tend to be around the high 80s, low 90s. The good thing about the local survey is that it allows us to look in much more detail than the national one, so I can actually look down to specific areas of the county and correlate that with any problems and issues that they're facing there to allow us to intervene on a more targeted basis.
Good, thank you very much. If we go on to page 8, rolling quarterly results for victim contact compliance. That has gone down by 6.5%. I wonder if you could talk us through that.
Yeah, I've actually asked my team for some clarifying information on this, because you'll note that there were some gaps in the data for 2018, yeah. And what I'm not entirely sure about as we sit here this morning is to whether that final dip relates to the rolling year and the gap in the data or not. So I've asked for clarification on that. We can certainly clarify it in the minutes of the meeting. The other thing to say is that we're moving to a new set of measures around actual victim experience, which could be these figures that we're looking at on compliance are other teams doing what we asked them to do in terms of keeping in touch with victims, for example, and satisfying the needs of the victim contact. That's important, but what it needs to be put alongside with is what the victims then actually say about their experience, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, but we're going to have a new series of measures that will give us much more up-to-date information that will then help us drive these compliance figures too.
Okay, thank you for that. Again, we'll need to take a look at that later on, particularly once the victim and witness care unit is beds in and other measures. I think I don't need to do that. Preventing harm, missing individuals. Now that's a good news story that the number of vulnerable missing individuals is going down, albeit it's still very, very high. And so thank you for that. What do you think has worked then to get these down?
Well, the first thing that we tried to do was really just get a handle on the volume of it. So you'll see from the chart, as we turned our attention to it, the first thing was understanding the scale and nature of it. At our divisional and force performance boards, we then look in minute detail at the individuals that this concerns and the locations from which they go missing from. What we then do is a specific problem-solving plan for those individuals or locations that allow us to try and find long-term solution to, you know, what may be causing them to go missing in the first place. So many of these are young people, but not always. There's a category within here that may relate to vulnerable elderly, for example. So it's about working with their carers, family environments to find plans that will deal with the underlying issues and prevent them from going missing. Because at any one time across the county, we're probably looking for something like 16 missing people at the same time. So it's a big impact on police resources, and if we can prevent it in the first place, then that's better for all concerned.
Yes, thank you very much for that, and I hope obviously that decline is accelerated. Yeah, and bottom of page 9, repeat domestic abuse offenders over the last years with 2 or more victims. That seems to be going up. Is there a particular reason for that, or is this a classification?
Well, again, this isn't for so over recent years we'd been measuring repeat victimisation, and there had been differences of professional opinions between us and support services about whether or not an increase in repeat victimisation was a good or a bad thing, bearing in mind we don't always know the full scale of the problem of domestic abuse. And domestic abuse by large forms the largest category of this high harm that we're looking at here. So in conjunction with that, we've also turned our attention to repeat offenders for domestic abuse. Again, firstly, to understand the scale and nature of it, and then what interventions may be successful. Interestingly, we mentioned earlier on in the meeting my visit to Durham. We share a scheme with Durham called Checkpoint, which is a activity to try and divert people from future offending. And I saw the latest figures from the Cambridge University study on Durham while I was up there to show that it is particularly effective for repeat domestic abuse offenders. So that's something that I'll be talking to the team about here. I know there are concerns about that, about the risks involved in doing that, particularly perhaps from our Crown Prosecution Service and courts colleagues, that often it's felt that the courts are the right place for domestic abuse. But what the very strong evaluation from Durham is showing is that actually a different set of interventions is more effective in reducing future harm. So we'll be looking very closely at that.
Good. And of course our Checkpoint Plus programme is bedding in now, I understand, quite well, and we're expecting high hopes from that. Thank you. I don't think I need to say anything on mental health. It's very clear from the report, but we're all very clear that mental health issues are obviously issues for those unfortunately suffering from those, but they are also issues for the community at large, and an enormous amount of resource has to go into helping those people, and arguably a lot of that is police and shouldn't be, and we need to work much better. with partners, especially, of course, the National Health Service, to get on top of that. Thank you. We're talking finance later. The estate strategy, we've now bought a new site near Leatherhead. Can't say too much. There's a lot of contractual negotiations going on to tie up the details. But just to say, Surrey Police are on their way now. There's a firm project plan in place, and if all goes well, I'm sure it will go well, then we will be in a new headquarters in the fullness of time, and that will not only save a lot of money, because we'll be able to close other police stations, but will also make us much more efficient. But I have to say, since it's a public meeting, to reassure people, I have to keep on saying this. What we're talking here is nothing to do with local policing. There will be a strong local police presence in every single borough of this county, as there is now, and that is my pledge to residents of Surrey. While I remain Police and Crime Commissioner, we will be there for you locally, as we always have been. I'm sure you can support that, Chief Constable. You better not support.
No, yes, I'm sure people will have realised by now that my sort of policing philosophy is very much rooted in local communities, and it's essential that we have a footprint in local communities and in each of the boroughs and districts. So, absolutely committed to that.
Thank you very much. That comes. That's the end of that meeting. Has anyone got any final comments before we move on? Good. So there's ups and downs there, but I'm reassured that where there are downs, and there are downs here, we talked about them, you recognise that and have plans in place to do something about it. And coming back to the extra resources, for the first time in 15 years, I think it is, Surrey Police has actually got more money than in the previous year. And so that means that provided we use that money wisely, and I think we will use it wisely, we can actually expect that extra resources to feed in to making our communities safer, and very much look forward to that, as of course does everybody. Thank you. I think we've got the finance report now. Peter, would you like to take us through that?
Commissioner, thank you. Yes,
We've all read it.
Thank you. So the report in summary, Commissioner, is based obviously on the March 2019 position, so the end of the financial year. In summary, against the force revenue budget of £212.6 million, the force spent £212 million. So that's an underspend of just 0.6 million, or 0.3 of 1% against the total. Overspends that we were planned and aware of on police officer pay during the year were compensated by and funded by underspends from police staff and non-pay budgets. Within those totals, Commissioner, I can also happy to report that the forces continue to deliver on its requirement to achieve savings. So there's a savings requirement of £5.3 million in the year, and the force slightly overachieved that target at £5.4 million. So absolutely maintaining that focus on delivering the good track record of budget savings as we go forwards. I think then moving on from revenue to the highlights of the capital programme, Commissioner, against the total capital revised budget of £34.4 million, spending at 31st of March was £30.1 million, so a variance of £4 million against the capital programme. Now, obviously, the key change on that programme at the end of the financial year related to the acquisition of the site that you've referred to at Leatherhead. That was the main variance in terms of the original budgeted figure compared to the revised budget. The areas of underspend against that £4 million were effectively, as we've previously highlighted, some IT programmes and some estates works. I think we've talked at previous meetings as well about improved arrangements that we're putting in place to focus really to ensure that we spend those capital schemes in the years that they are allocated for. And we are carrying out a series of quarterly stakeholder reviews with all of the capital programme scheme leads to ensure that throughout this new financial year that we've got a kind of a closer handle on that capital spend to ensure that we minimise any slippage across the years as we go forwards. So, Commissioner, in total, I think a very positive year-end financial result for the force based on that end of March position. You specifically requested at one of the previous accountability meetings to ensure that when we were projecting a slight overspend with force, that obviously our commitment was to bring that in on target. We've done that in recent months to ensure that that has been delivered on budget without small underspend as I've suggested. So happy to pick up any questions, Commissioner, on that basis.
Good, thank you. I think this is a generally a very positive report, and thank you for that. Yes, underspend overall, and as you know, and we all know, it's really important that we do meet our revenue balances, the targets, that is the basis for all the other financial planning. So thank you for that. And I do look to you and everyone else that in a year's time we have the same picture. Underneath that overall balance, there are some variances, of course. I'm pleased to see that police overtime looks better in control than it was. I think there's a bit of a way to go, but the direction of travel is fine. Overtime is essential. Naturally, we'll be using some of this in the coming week, I bet, with all the pressures we talked about. But I did feel it was getting too much of a good thing, so I'm glad to see that we've cracked down on that. Yeah.
Commissioner, just on that, we have set up a regular overtime working group where that is specifically targeted each month in terms of the requirements and the actual costs. We'll continue to do that through the course of this financial year as well.
Good. I'm a little worried about the underspend on police staff. I know we have a policy of not immediately filling jobs as they become vacant, and that's correct policy. It sort of begs the question, if we're consistently underspent, should we be looking at whether some of those posts are necessary in the first place? And just to, no, I don't want to raise alarms here. We've valued the staff. As far as I'm concerned, a staff member is just as important as a police officer. They do different things, but we're all part of one team, and low morale amongst staff, not that there is, I don't think, is just as important as conditions on the front lines. I just wanted to make that point. But yeah, my question is, should we be looking at the staff establishment, bringing it more into line with what actually happens on the ground?
Commissioner, thank you. Just in terms of kind of context, you're absolutely right. We have a planned vacancy rate of 5% for police staff. Obviously the vacancies during the course of the year were kind of in excess of that 5% vacancy rate. It is something that we keep under constant review. When Mr. Rutherford, our colleague, the Director of People Services, carries out his kind of broader picture of the workforce plan, we obviously take account of both current establishment, current strength, and views for the future. So we will keep that under review, but it has certainly been part of our planned approach this year to compensate for the elements of the planned known spend on police officers.
If I can turn to capital, it looks better, but a lot of that is a bit artificial because we brought forward into the previous year the expenditure on the Leatherhead site. And that was originally planned for this financial year, and things moved faster. If you strip that out, we're still not spending the capital in year that you're allowed to spend. And I absolutely accept we don't want this crazy system of scrambling around every March to spend the money. So some carry forward is right, but we've got too much of it.
Commissioner, thank you. Yes, and I would agree that our profiling of capital spend compared to capital approvals historically has seen that constant slippage. We do manage the programme over a 2-year period rather than a 12 months to avoid that 31st of March scramble as you referred to. So we've got a planned approach, but absolutely our commitment is, as we go forwards, to ensure that we do use those resources in the years that they're allocated for. So that's been the key driver for having set up the process of establishing the quarterly performance workshops on capital with each of the capital budget holders.
We all look for improvements in this year, but thank you for that. And lastly, before we move on, thank you for the savings. That's good. I think we can now call them reinvestment. For real, we are taking money out of lower priority areas and putting it back now in the context of an expanding budget generally, putting that money into higher priorities. So to the people who are affected by cuts, of course it's a saving and a cut, and sometimes painful. I absolutely appreciate that. But in the overall content, we're actually moving money elsewhere rather than cutting it to make overall savings. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, that is a fair thing to say, Commissioner. One of the things that we'll talk about in the later items actually is our ongoing commitment to ensure that where we do make efficiencies, they're now in future very much directed to supporting the additional investment that the precepts enabled in the front line.
Good, thank you very much. Did you have anything else? Right, I think that's all I need to say. Any last words, Peter?
No, thank you, Commissioner. We'll obviously continue to bring forward the monitoring based on the precept uplift that's been included in the New Year's budget as we carry forward this year and onwards.
Good, look forward to that. Right, the next item then is budget and workforce planning. I specially asked for this report. For the first time ever, residents are asking me, and quite a number of them, how big should Surrey Police be? And I'm saying that's a very interesting question, and I'm asking that now. I should be asking it now. There's been no point in asking it up to now because we've been cutting, and we all know we've got not enough officers and staff, so there's no point in having spending money on just a dream. But now we are expanding, so I think it is worthwhile asking. It's a very simple question. What should the size of our Surrey Police be? But it's a simple question. It's not at all a simple answer. But I do think we need to make more strides there. And I have to say, I don't think this report quite does it. Thank you. It's a start. But I'm looking in future, for future reports, much more of a forward-looking report, not just what we have done, and we've done some impressive things, but how we collectively want to shape Surrey Police for the next 5, 10 and so on years. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. That's very clear and helpful. You're exactly right. This report in front of us today deals with the short-term uplift and growth, effectively. To say what our recruitment is looking like over the coming year, how we're going to get those additional posts in, which we were aiming for 100. It'll be actually more than 100 because we think it's 79 plus the 25 that we weren't going to lose.
It's 104.
Yes, plus the 25 that we weren't going to lose, so that's good news. But I entirely agree with you that we need to be more forward-facing. So I did raise this at our Chief Officer meeting last week, where I've effectively posed the question in 2 parts to the team. So there's how big do we think the force should be under its current model of service provision? So how we currently police, how much more of that would you want to do? And I think some of those questions are quite simple. So, for example, in the neighbourhood policing world, which I know is very important to local communities. At the sort of peak of investment in 2008, we had 110 neighbourhood police officers. Even with our growth, we'll be at something like 44. So there are areas like that where you could give a clear indication as to what an uplift would give you in terms of additional service provision. But I think there's a longer term question, as you've pointed out, because when you look at national reports on things like fraud and cyber, when you look at the developing 2030 vision for the county, then there's no doubt that the nature of policing will change in that time frame, and the sort of services that we'll need to provide will change. So I think there's a forward-facing element as to how we equip the force for 2020, 25, 2030 and beyond. So we will do our best to answer the question in two parts. How big do we think it should be under current service provision, and how do we think we ought to start shaping it for the future?
Good, I look forward to that. In the short term, as part of the budget round in November, the policing minister will ask all PCCs personally, as they asked, Mr. Hurd asked me, how much money do you want, realistically, and what will you do with it, and what will be the effects on the community? And I wasn't really able to answer last time, but I do want a much better answer now, accepting that this is a longer term. We're not going to get everything we want in 1 year, but so thank you for that. And I think it should be a particular focus on the planning side now. Just a couple of questions in more detail. An attraction strategy. You do make a glancing reference to it in the report. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so one of the things, particularly for Surrey, with its place in the home counties, proximity to London, cost of living in the area, there are many of those things where we cannot compete on salary. Colleagues can jump on the train up into London for higher salaries and opportunities. But what we can compete on is the sort of organisation that Surrey Police is, and what it feels like to work here. That's a whole package of things. There are some local benefits that we can provide that might be monetary in value, or certainly have an impact on people's purse. But equally, there's the nature and the type of work, the opportunities and development that we provide. All of that comes together to what you could call an attraction strategy. Why should somebody come and work for Surrey Police? So Adrian Rutherford and his team, and along with Pete's team from the financial aspect, think very carefully about what that package is and how we make ourselves a very attractive employer.
Good, thank you. As you know, I'm the National Lead for Equalities, Diversity and Human Rights, and one of the themes in there is police diversity. We nationally are not as diverse in terms of BME, for instance, but there are other categories as the populations that we serve, and it's a common aim of everyone that we come more aligned to them, not necessarily exactly, but we do better. So I would urge you, it's difficult to change the mix of our force if you're not recruiting at all, or only replacing natural wastage. We have an opportunity now to get a really, really good set of people coming in, both officers and staff, to serve our community. So I would urge you not to not grasp that golden opportunity. And I've made similar representation. I've written to all my colleagues, in fact, saying, for goodness sake, don't lose this opportunity to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. I'll leave it to that.
Commissioner, thank you. Just in terms of just absolutely endorsing that, we absolutely recognise that this is a perfect opportunity for us to begin to change that shape. We are working really hard with the Positive Action team to ensure that we're engaging with all areas of the community to do just that. So we'll look at those community career opportunities within the force from both a police officer and a police staff perspective.
The last thing is there is a summary of value for money profiles. I don't intend to deal with that here, but I think I would like to return to it in more detail. We'll do that in a private session. I think it makes more sense to do that. Okay. Oh yes, no mention of specials here. I'm sure that was an oversight. I know specials are important to you, Chief, as they are to everyone. Would you just like to comment on that aspect?
Yes, so there is a separate strategy that deals with our volunteer base, which includes specials, police staff, volunteers, cadets and so on. So we haven't covered those figures in here, but we very much see that as an important part of the broader policing family and workforce.
Great, yeah. And all the specials I've met at various ranks, I've been really bowled over by their enthusiasm. And to hold down typically 2 demanding jobs, not just one, I think deserves our real praise. So well done to them. Yeah. Right, item 7 then is force efficiency strategy. We've got a short paper here. Who wants to just...
happy to just briefly introduce the paper, Commissioner. So obviously we've talked at length previously about the force having delivered significant savings and efficiencies over the recent years, particularly from 2010. We've delivered £76 million worth of savings over that period to date. But we do really remain committed, despite the fact that we have kind of the precept uplift now, to actually continue to ensure our services represent good value for money and that we constantly look for efficiencies in what we do. That absolutely plays straight to your comment in the last item, Commissioner, around the fact that actually we are looking at areas of investment, and the really important thing about continuing to have a strong focus on efficiencies is that we can protect, firstly, that investment that you've helpfully enabled us with the public to deliver, but also then to look where we can actually reinvest some of the priorities to take things forwards. So protecting that £3.8 million of additional investments, a really important issue. To ensure we remain kind of clear and strongly focused on efficiencies, the DEP with Mr. Stevens' blessing has put forward kind of this approach with me as far as continuing to embed a strong focus on efficiencies within the force as we go forwards, from both looking at it from an operational policing perspective and a professional support enabling services perspective from police staff as well. Really important that we've got the ability to both have a top-down approach where we can, clearly identify some of the bigger strategic things like big procurement savings, but also from a bottom-up perspective, ensuring we've got the right collection of ideas and energy from people on the ground, kind of in all of our services. So effectively, the efficiency strategy is a starting point about bringing together that top-down and bottom-up approach to ensure that we continue to focus on delivering efficiencies across the force. Some of that may be in partnership, some of that may be by, as I've said, looking at things like you've talked earlier as well about the great opportunity that you have with our new HQ programme to completely look at an improved efficiency on our buildings.
Sorry, HE, sorry?
HQ, sorry. Yes,
Yeah,
sorry, yes,
yeah.
yes, the move to Leatherhead. So really having an opportunity across the piece to look at all of the areas of business that we have to try and capture ongoing efficiencies, particularly with that view in mind, to ensure that those efficiencies protect the investment that we've made and actually enable, where possible, a level of reinvestment in the services as well.
Thank you. I think it's really, really important. And frankly, I can't honestly start suggesting raising precepts unless I can look residents who pay the precepts in the eye and say, every pound that you give us will be well spent. And I haven't come across, I have to say, glaring examples of inefficiencies. So I believe Surrey Police is efficient, but we can always do better, and we've got to do better as well. So thank you for this strategy, but I sort of look forward to the implementation. And I may say, I'll ask for comment. My own office are not immune to this, and we've actually started an efficiency strategy as well. A small beer compared to the over 200 million of Surrey Police, but nevertheless, it's up to all of us to play our part. And that includes the Chief Constable's Department and indeed Finance Director's Department as well.
Thanks, Commissioner. Just one final point. I mentioned earlier that the Deputy had given apologies today. He was keen to point out that the strategy is still in draft, so of course welcomes comments from your office, but indeed anybody that's looking through the papers today with views and ideas. We're always open to where we can get the best value for money. I hope at the next meeting to be able to report formally on actually some results that have come through this already. I know, for example, in some IT contract negotiations that Peter touched on earlier, that they've had some particularly noticeable successes. So we'll formally report that in due course.
Yep. Good. Well, I hope that's a start of a new journey. Thank you very much on that. The next one then is retail crime. We have a paper here, and Chief, would you like to just bring out the highlights of this paper?
Thanks, Commissioner. I know that you and I had spoken at some of the events about the importance of partnership with local businesses, and of course one of the key business sectors that it's important for us to have a constructive relationship with is the retail sector. As the paper points out, there are three sort of key categories of crime that affect the retail sector, most notably in Surrey: shoplifting, robbery of commercial premises, so that's the threat of violence or the use of violence to steal from there, and making off without payment, which is broadly people driving off without paying for their fuel, or on rare occasions leaving the restaurant without paying. What the paper talks about is our response to this. It'd be no surprise by now to say that primarily we try to work to prevent these things in the first place. And there are some examples in the paper of where the local neighbourhood teams have worked on specific issues with specific retailers to try and prevent the offending in the first place. And that would be an offer of mine to any business, not just in the retail sector, that's watching or listening or reading the papers, who feel they've got a particular problem. We have design out crime officers that can give dedicated time and advice to businesses and retailers, and we have local neighbourhood teams who will work with you to try and prevent the issues happening in the first place. Due to the volume, I mentioned earlier in the meeting about how we make an assessment on solvability and vulnerability. Very often in these cases there aren't particular vulnerabilities, so unless the solvability factors are clear, this is often, as retailers will know, a loss that they have to account for and try and prevent through their own loss prevention measures, because we simply don't have the resource to be able to do detailed follow-up investigations on each and every one of these offences. So the paper very much outlines that our approach is one of prevention.
I'd certainly agree with that. I have retailers, understandably, some of them are very worried about this. It may sound small beer, but of course it can mean the difference between a successful business and a failing business, and so I feel really sorry for them. Every time they talk to me, I urge retailers to report every single instance of shoplifting, and I'm sure your experience, sometimes they feel that it's not worth the hassle of reporting, nothing gets done. I've had that quite a number of times. I think that's a wrong attitude, a very understandable one, but the message has to be keep reporting, and so that the police are aware of the scale of the problem. Nothing else. I'm sure you'd endorse that.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Commissioner, because in particular in the paper does point out, of course, there are occasions when there is organised criminality behind some of the theft, and where that's the case, of course, we will respond and try and deal with that organised criminality, but if it's not reported, then we don't know, so please do continue to report.
Just a couple of things. First of all, congratulations. There's some very good examples in this paper of some excellent problem solving, and I hope they're beacons for everyone else, so well done to them. The other one thing, shoplifting is a crime, and the people who shoplift are criminals. There's no question about that. But sometimes it can be what they call a cry for help. It's sometimes what's called a signal crime, I think, which means there are deeper underlying issues there. And it can be a gateway, of course, more serious crime, more serious problems. How do Surrey Police handle that aspect?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we would want businesses and retailers to continue to report, because as the paper mentioned and as I discussed, the two areas that we assess are solvability, but also the vulnerability factors. And of course, some of those vulnerability factors might be in relation to the actual offender. I spent some time with the Women's Support Centre last week, It's not uncommon for mums that are struggling to survive to shoplift food to feed their children. And of course, if that's an opportunity for us to get support services involved, to point them in the direction of other organisations that can help, as well as dealing with the crime, then that's an opportunity to do so. So, hence the plea to continue to report, because some of those factors may well become relevant.
There's one last thing. I know, Chief, you feel very strongly that if there was a system of prepayment for petrol, gas, then the category of making off without payment would disappear.
Yep, this making off without payment, certainly from petrol station forecourts, is an entirely preventable crime. Of course, we've probably all visited places around the world where you have to pay in advance before receiving your fuel. That's not the case in this country. My belief is that that's largely driven by the retail opportunities of going into the forecourts to purchase supplies and so on. But if major retailers are not willing to adopt that step, then we do need them to have in place the absolute best prevention measures in terms of good open surveillance, CCTV, monitoring of their forecourt to try and prevent this wherever possible.
I am in touch with my own association to see whether we can get anything moving on a national scale. I suspect there are. It's more complicated than it looks, but at least let's make that point, make that more stronger point. Thank you. That's all on retail, unless you've got any last-minute comment. Thank you. And we go on to untaxed and uninsured vehicles, which is a very contentious subject, especially in relation to unauthorised encampments, as we know. It's a complicated issue as well. So could you talk us through that, Chief? We might need to spend a little time on this.
Yeah, and my thanks go to Inspector Dean and Chief Inspector Davis for putting this very, very detailed and interesting paper together. If anybody is thinking about looking at the papers today, then this is one where I'm pretty sure you will learn something new. Not at all the same to say that I learned some things new from reading it. So that the team have looked in quite some detail about this issue. The first thing to say is, of course, that the lead agency for untaxed vehicles is the Driver Vehicle Licensing Agency, DVLA, as people will know them. And at the end of 2018, there was estimated to be over 34 million licensed vehicles in England and Wales. So that gives you an idea of the number of vehicles on the road, and it's suspected that around 2% of these vehicles, or around 700,000, are incorrectly taxed, and in addition to that, there are around 1 million uninsured vehicles on the roads. So the police do have some devolved powers to deal with this, but the DVLA have a greater range. What the paper goes on to set out is, and there's an interesting table at the end of the paper, is that the different types of action that can be taken for no tax or no MOT, no driver's licence, no insurance, and there's a range of options then available to police and other agencies, depending on whether it's in a public place or on a road. So members of the local community may find that interesting, because sometimes when they see a vehicle that they believe might not be taxed or insured, then that helps guide them in the best course of action to take. And there are also details of a publicly available website, DVLA website, where any member of the public can check the particular status of a vehicle. From a policing point of view, of course, we do joint operations with DVLA and others. We have a very close working relationship with the Motor Insurance Bureau and use of their database, and we'll use some of the options available to us for enforcement operations against crime. Of course, criminals use the road, and sometimes this is a very good disruption tactic to deal with criminal activity. And we have a very good network of both static and mobile automatic number plate reader cameras, which will flag up to us suspicious vehicles that need investigating further. I know that we discussed at previous meetings how some of these tactics can be applied, for example, to those on unauthorised encampments that are particularly disruptive and antisocial, and this paper describes how we can respond to that. Perhaps the final point that I'd just draw from the paper is something called Operation Tutelage. So this is about how I guess we work with the partner agencies, Motor Insurance Bureau in particular, to drive up the number of insured vehicles, which of course is a safety improvement for all concerned. So we have a system whereby we send an initial advisory letter, a sort of nudge, as it were, that you need to really act upon this, and then there's a police follow-up letter, and what that shows is that 80% of uninsured vehicles actually go on to insure their vehicles after those advisory notices. Of course, that gives us then a much smaller cohort to target in terms of persistent offending. So I'll probably pause there, Commissioner, for any questions or comments.
Yes, talking about tutelage, what you're talking about, the statistics I've seen, they seem almost too good to be true, but I don't doubt them. And the fact is that most uninsured vehicles are uninsured because the driver or the owner has been a bit casual about it. They're not wicked people. They're not out there deliberately to defraud. And if you give them a polite nudge, as you say, most of them will actually fall in line and insure their vehicles. So that's really good. And as you say, it allows you to concentrate on the people who are involved in criminality.
And related to that, Commissioner, the other thing that the teams have told me is that it's not unusual for them to stop vehicles on the road that they believe to be uninsured, where the driver clearly thinks it is, and often it's an error. So the vehicle is actually uninsured, but there's an error in taking out the insurance in maybe one number or letter is incorrectly put in. So I guess that's a plea to all of us for our policies. It really does pay to check your policy. I know we always get the letter through saying, you check this within 28 days, let us know of any errors. Often there are errors and we uncover them on the roads, so it's very important for people to check.
And before we leave this, what I know annoys many residents, and I have great sympathy for them, that they just want everybody in the community, wherever they come from, to be treated equally, and there to be no perceived discrimination whatsoever. So I would look to Surrey Police to have an absolutely consistent policy without fear or favour to crack down on this. Not, of course, removing personal responsibility from your officers who have to use their judgment on a daily basis, and we all realise that. So thank you for that. That's a very interesting table, which I will use in future. So anything else? Good, thank you. Yeah, I've got some further questions on this, but I will leave it. I'll do that in private. And lastly, then is no, it isn't. Item 10, the fraud and cyber update. Thank you for that. And this is a report from Detective Superintendent Mitzi. I think the main question I had is, how, what is the Surrey Police's future plans, and especially in the preventative side, to try and get on top of this serious and fast-growing crime?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, I think it's very much goes towards one of the questions that we were addressing earlier about, how big should the service be and where would we choose to invest more. There's absolutely no doubt that we could invest an awful lot more in tackling fraud and cybercrime. The paper sets out in quite stark detail just the scale of the challenge, and in particular how it affects residents in Surrey. So we do actually rank 4th in terms of England and Wales for some of the reporting on fraud. Obviously, overall, it's an affluent county, and when you look at the types of fraud, telephone fraud to the vulnerable elderly, for example, then it's in some ways it's no surprise that we do suffer, particularly in Surrey. So on the prevention side, there are some clear recommendations from a national inspection report as to how we should respond. In Surrey, we absolutely accept and will be acting on each of those recommendations. And at 3.5 in the paper, there's some details there of some of the support and prevention work that we do, safeguarding and advice that we can give to vulnerable victims, and some of the schemes that we take part in to identify the vulnerable and try and prevent these offences happening. But I guess I have to be realistic and say that there is so much more that that we could do in this area, given the resource.
Well, I think that everybody has to agree with that. I'm pleased that Surrey Police either have or are in the process of implementing the HMIC FRS recommendations published last month. That's obviously good. My belief is that nationally we need a fundamental rethink of fraud, and it should be a national policing response should be the default, with, of course, local police input naturally. At the moment, I think it's the other way round. You have to call for help nationally. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Now, actually having a different mind shift is going to take a long time. It will presumably extra resources and so on. But what's your take on that, Chief?
I agree, and I guess one insight into that is when you just look at the sort of scale of the policing activity against the scale of the problem. So the paper describes that the overall cost of fraud estimated at something like 190 billion. When you look at some of the seizures and restraints that we're achieving locally, although significant. So, for example, we had £2.3 million worth of confiscation orders, £500,000 of cash seizures, £200,000 of confiscation. So, you know, the teams are busy and active and getting some very good results. Of course, those figures, a couple of million, 500,000, they literally are a drop in the ocean compared to the sort of 190 billion scale of it, particularly when you consider that Surrey is right up there in terms of its vulnerability in the league table. So there does need to be a shift at a national level in approach to dealing with it.
I'll play my part in taking that up, but I suspect it will require joint coordinated action over quite some period of time, so don't hold our breaths, unfortunately. Really, two things I think I'd like to say. First of all, thank you to your teams, and going to be augmented teams, because part of the 100 extra, some of those will be allocated to fraud, which will be good news for a lot of people, so wish them luck. And secondly, what I've learnt, I think, is so much of fraud is preventable if people would take precautions that in hindsight are obvious, but of course not at the time. So it's a duty of all of us, all residents, to make life more difficult for the fraudsters. Yeah. Anything more on that?
Well, only just to say, Commissioner, on that final point, that it may sound very basic, but sometimes just being neighbourly. So if you have an elderly neighbour who you know, maybe is in receipt of some of the postal fraud issues, the telephone scams and queries, they may not have family locally, actually just looking out for your neighbour in the same way that we would ask you to look out for maybe a neighbour that's been a victim of burglary, and think about how you can come together as a community to do more prevention work. It might sound basic and small scale, but it actually works. So I would encourage communities to do that.
Absolutely, yes. That's really, a really good point. Thank you. I think we've reached the end of the formal part of the meeting, in fact, the meeting. So could I just say to anybody who has stayed the course with us, thank you very much for watching and listening. And again, if there's anything that particularly caught your attention, you'd like further information, or perhaps you'd like to comment on anything that's happened or anything that didn't happen, please let us know, and we promise to answer you as comprehensively as we can. So final thanks then to everybody who was watching this public performance meeting. And I think we can switch off the cameras.